I was working. Sorry, I got it. I was working in racial justice during that time, and that's when it struck me that she was in her 80s. Lakshmi
Mm,
Shankar was in her 80s, and that her story was in danger of disappearing.
mm,
And that just made me so sad, and I thought, well, somebody has to do something about this. And I thought somebody as in somebody else, I didn't know how to write a biography. I didn't know, I didn't have any connections in the book world. And, just the thought of it, I had written letters to the editors and op-eds. I mean, that's what I'd
mm,
written. And I had been uh, in a writing group, writing things that were kind of autobiographical, in nature. But I was doing it really for my own edification and, finding community, particularly amongst a group of South Asian women writers. But I didn't have aspirations for becoming a
mm,
writer. At least that's what I was telling myself at the moment, because I had my hands full. And so that's what I think is the best thing, is that what is it, John Lennon, who said, life is what happens while you're making other plans, or
mm,
something like that. I'm
mm,
to that effect. So I suddenly felt haunted. That's the best word I can use. I
mm,
felt haunted in the sense of, are you really going to let this happen? And even though I didn't have a logical answer of how I was going to go about doing this, I suddenly felt compelled. And
mm,
Lakshmi Shankar was in Los Angeles. I was in New York. So I said, okay, well, let me at least start by collecting her story. So it started with that. And I went out there and recorded and, asked her lots of questions. And it really started, if I'm very honest, when Ravi Shankar died.
mm,
He
okay.
passed away, and it hit me like a ton of bricks, because I know it's so obvious, but you kind of believe that your icons are going to live forever. And I suddenly realized her mortality, and
Mm,
that she wouldn't be with us. And that's when I thought, oh my gosh, this is really in danger of
mm,
being lost. I mean, thankfully, he had written his own memoir autobiography, and others had written, and someone was working on his biography, Oliver Crask. And so his story was covered, like, honestly, most male figures, and
mm,
female figures, I think, are often obscured.
mm,
Um, so I went about trying to, like, collect her story. And then I thought, and then and the truth is, about a year into it, while I was still working and everything, she passed away. And I had, recorded interviews that I had, and there was so much more that I had wanted to, ask her.
mm,
And so the question was, what was I going to do? Would I just write, an article and call it a day, or would I try to write this biography? And how does one do that? How do you find a publisher? All that kind of, those questions were there. And so I just kind of set forth in doing that. And then while I was doing that, because I had worked, in the realm of social change for 15 years, and I honestly was very shocked, even coming late to writing and not coming from a traditional background, I just called together, I went to Tin House, summer writing workshop several times, and that was an amazing experience. And I went to VONA, Voices of Our
mm.
Nation's Artists. I went to just, and as I'm sure others have talked about, the workshop experience is it can be bracing, it can be amazing, it can
Yeah.
be dispiriting, demoralizing. I
Uh,
kind of experienced it all. And I guess I was taking it all with me. And later, when I would create my class, I would think about, what is it that I want to keep from there, and what do I not want to replicate because of how
mm,
damaging it was. But ultimately, while I was writing, I was working on the book, which was, I didn't realize was going to be a 6-year, 7-year process.
oh,
I would write, kind of just to stay sane and to make some money and to just kind of get bylines, about the issues that I most cared about, that I had been working on,
mm,
issues of race. And particularly in the publishing sector, now we talk about it more, but like, the publishing sector is 80 to 85% white, particularly in terms of the publishers. And I was like, in the beginning, now we talk about it, but at the time it really wasn't remarked upon. So I was like, coming from racial justice to that was really bracing, and I'd be like, are we not going to talk about this? Are we not going to write about this? So I would write about these things. I wrote about it for the Atlantic and for Los Angeles Review of Books, and I could tell, the reaction from people's reactions. Some people were like, yes, I'm so glad that you wrote about this. I totally agree. And there were people, more and more people writing about it. And then there were those who didn't appreciate it. It was like I had said something, inappropriate at dinner. It's like that, like you're not supposed to expose these, like, yeah. And I completely don't agree with that, particularly in the world of ideas. So that's where, so I wrote and I wrote more and more. And then I would have sometimes writers, fellow writers turning to me because they wanted to write about social, and they would ask for my advice. And then I sat down and thought, when I came to writing, I had to negotiate, I guess I'll use the word compromise, because it's always, like figuring out how to write about this thing I care about in a way that does justice to the issue, but in a way that's
compelling, right?
That is compelling and that has narrative. And the truth was, I knew the social issues part of it, but I had to learn the craft of writing, and I had to understand, and I had to kind of be honest with myself, because in the sense of when I'm a reader, I am, when I'm a reader, when I'm reading novels, when I'm, in terms of my pleasure reading, I had to be honest about what were the things that were the elements that most intrigued me, really interesting characters, really interesting voice, voice is probably the most nebulous thing. It's so hard to, nail down, but it when you see it. So really look at the elements, that I was most interested in. And when I sat down and thought about, why did this piece of writing that I had done work? Why did it work? And why did other things that I write, while full of wonderful facts and important, crucial facts, but it actually felt like a lead balloon, why was that? And it was because I had approached it more like a policy brief rather than saying, I really want you to know about this, and I'm really excited for you to know about this. I'm going to pull you in this way. I'm going to, think about the narrative. And that's how, those were the beginnings of me putting together this class on writing about social issues. And I found that, people would show up, and the people who take the class are a mix of social change agents, who are working in the field, who want to share what they know, academics who are trying to, in some ways, unlearn the way they've been taught to write, in this, ivory tower away from academic to academic, and they really, want to move the needle and talk to others. And then, as I mentioned, like there are people who, my class is their first writing class, and people who are deeply affected by the issue. They are either witnesses to it or they've experienced it, and they're finally at a point where they want to write about it. And some of them are excellent storytellers, and I really just try to encourage them and push them forward. So this book grew out of the class, because with the class I'm only able to reach a few people at a time, but the book is able to get out there into the world. And really my ultimate goal through the class and with the book is to help encourage more writers of conscience, people who want to engage these issues, but maybe they're a little bit afraid because of how fraught things are, at the moment, and they're trying to figure out how to do so.
Yeah, thank you. So the book is broken into the 7 chapters. I don't know if you call them chapters. Yeah. 7 chapters: the intro, the conclusion. The intro is done by Mira Jacob.
Yes.
Who's a great one, right?
Yeah.
You write about later in the book about one of her I guess like a keynote speech that was ironically kind of underappreciated, and she was able to write about it and kind of get more of the word out. But she writes about, words as community. Both of you write about connecting, about, there are a lot of people doing the good work, whether through writing, whether through the social change, or both. And it's about, you're able to connect people. It's one thing to be writing, to be working in an isolated way, but it's another to bring about social change together, right?
And you asked that great question earlier that I forgot to get to, and it relates to this. You
Mm-hmm.
asked, how did I decide? How did I decide on the
Yeah.
format and anthology? And essentially two reasons. One is that, in the class, one of the ways that we learn, like I can tell them, here are my thoughts on context versus narrative, and here are my, here's the lesson on it. But I find the best way that we learn is by seeing those principles in action in the writing, and you can see how a writer has done that through their writing. So that's what we did. So I didn't want a book of theory, or craft, book that I'm like, okay, well, good luck,
Yeah.
I told you these things. So I wanted them to see it. And and I put in, I had thoughts about whether I should include my own work or not in this book. So in my original plans, it was not there. And then I thought, but I can dissect other people's work to some extent, but I can't tell you why they did what they did. I can show you it in action. Whereas with me, I can come clean and say, okay, this is where I started, this is where I ended up, this is what I had misgivings about, this is what ended up happening, and I'm really glad about it. Like, as we talked about, like my piece about being born with a cleft palate, I felt like if I was going to talk to other people about putting their own writing about their lives out in the world, I wanted to share what it was like for me to do that. But then the other reason I did an anthology is exactly the reason you mentioned, which is that writing can be a very lonely affair. And on top of that, if you're writing about fraught issues where everybody's either pro or anti, and it has this kind of, particularly now more than ever, this kind of combative, fraught feeling, it's important to know, and I think it's very inspiring to know that you're part of a long tradition of people, whether it's Orwell and, so many people today on so many different issues, writing with different approaches and different voices. And so I wanted people to be able to gravitate and find an approach that speaks to them, and to know that they are part of a community, even if it doesn't feel like that in that moment. So that was the other reason it was really important to do an anthology. And I spent the first 6 months not writing a word. I spent the first 6 months figuring out which voices and pieces to include in the book before I even moved forward.
Oh, man. Well, so many cool voices throughout. I'm a big fan of anthologies and epigraphs, and you have the great Jericho Brown, the Pulitzer Prize winning poet. Basically, that every poem is a love poem, every poem is a political poem, right? The title of the first chapter is Why We Write, Interrogating Our Motivations for Writing About Social Issues. And the question basically comes up, and is all writing political? And I think a lot of times the people who will say no are people who have the privilege to not to be apolitical, right? Me as a white man, I don't necessarily have to. It's kind of assumed. A lot of people have written about this more eloquently than I'm saying it, but I can maybe assume that people know that my characters are, whomever or whatever, or right. This idea of like being apolitical is definitely a privilege in itself, right?
It's a privilege and a fallacy. It's both. It's kind of both at the same. And so literally the first thing I do in my class before even people introduce themselves to each other is I ask this question: is all writing political? And we have this great conversation where people say, well, this kind of writing is, or that writing isn't. Well, novels aren't, and sci-fi, we have this free-ranging conversation, and it's really good that we have a conversation about it. And and my own feeling based on, my background in social change work and in writing and as a reader is that all writing is political. All writing is political. And really, it's irrespective of the intentions of the writer, because as I mentioned, and it's a little scary, I know, intimidating, this thought that like once your work is out into the world, irrespective of what your intentions are, there's how it's and so it's read through the perception of the reader and who they are and their own identity. So that's and also there's, the way I think about it, there's writing that's more explicitly political, and there's writing that's just more quietly political. And I think I gave the example in the book of like, when you have Sex and the City come out, and it's, about the most diverse city, potentially in the world, and there are no substantive characters of color,
Hmm.
intentional or not, a decision has been made, a narrative decision. And I think that's the other question is like, the title of the book really kind of speaks to this idea that issues like race, gender, sexuality, all kinds of identity issues are not separate from craft. And that's often how they've been approached in the workshop or in discussions. It's like, oh, we got, and you have people literally say, we have to take identity issues out of the classroom. We have to take them out of, and actually, characters are all built by these things. They're all shaped by these things. So why would we approach them separately? It's about having embodied characters that are robust, that feel real to us. So I have a hard time understanding why this would be a separate conversation from craft. To me, it's part and parcel of craft.
Huh. You have a great quote from Christine Amanpour, the famous
Christiane Amanpour, yes.
Yeah, the famous journalist, and just basically, and this comes up throughout the book, like just it's about like Caitlin Greenridge kind of speaks to the same idea of like, well, maybe not exactly, but Amanpour talks about being truthful and not neutral.
Yes.
Later in the book, you talk about like the whole like both sides issue, and we need to show both sides, and
yes.
a lot of and people are saying, well, there's a moral truth, right? And so Amanpour draws the distinction between being truthful and neutral. Those are not the same things, right?
This is a key distinction for me, and I think what helped me was in journalism, right? There's like they hold objectivity so high and so lofty, and so I'm asking a question of, it might seem provocative to some, but if you have extremely undiverse mastheads and newsrooms, and they're covering during the era of the George Floyd murder, what does that look like? What does that what does that process look like? Who's covering it? How are they covering it? And I also know that networks of Black journalists, even though they're so underrepresented, were being overwhelmed with being pushed to cover this trauma. So it was like re-traumatizing because so it's this question of neutrality. Whose neutrality? Right. I push back against this notion of objectivity and neutrality, because really in some ways it's just covering that it's only that only belongs to certain people. The notion of objectivity and neutrality, and Christiane Amanpour and Masha Gessen, two journalists I so hugely respect, kind of talk about truth, and that truth is not necessarily pursued by pursuing objectivity and neutrality, but actually involves compassion and digging deeper and thinking about where the writer does think about themselves and their institution that they're representing relative to who they're reporting on. And Caitlin Greenidge also really kind of pushes back also in the great piece that's included in the book about who gets to write about whom.
Right. So the first chapter is a lot about why, Orwell, like you mentioned, he's basically saying like, I'm lifeless, or my writing's lifeless without political purpose. And the great James Baldwin was, I think it was ironically, maybe not ironically, but coincidentally, I think from a 1984 interview.
Yes.
Right. Orwell, 1984. But Baldwin said basically like, I don't want to be pushed into that. Like, he wasn't so keen on like that everything has to be political purpose.
No.
And obviously context, as the book mentions so much, context matters so much that like, I kind of relate it to now, where it's like, there's so many writers of color who are just like, hey, I just want to write about.
Sure, right. Yeah.
I want to write about different types of characters, right? I even feel like I'm, pushed to write a certain, like it's the whole Percival Everett type of book, right?
Yes.
Right. And so, you do chart how he did change over the years and some of his comments, but it's not so interesting. Like, hey, like let's not box anybody in, but let's especially not box in the great James Baldwin, right?
No, and I loved that in writing I wanted to include it, but I wanted to show that he himself went through his own evolution. He's a chronicler who was, chronicling, as a Black a gay Black writer, you know, during the civil rights era, felt compelled to move out of the States because of, you know, the everything that was going on and how oppressive it was, came back, you know. So there's so much going on. And so like really understanding that essay as part of his oeuvre, you know, and how, you know, it's like beautiful. Even in the course of an essay, you can kind of see him going back and forth and, you know, thinking about it and how he feels. And this is the tension I feel, honestly, you know, as I work on things. Sometimes the part of me that has worked in social change for 15 years feels like maybe I've compromised too much for the sake of aesthetics, for the sake of narrative. And sometimes it's an issue of whom I'm writing for, not just the audience, but like the platform, you know. So, and you know, and I've been thankful that I've had great editors who, you know, sometimes have said, oh, well, you know, some have wanted me to explain much more. And I'm like, you know what, I don't, if it's a literary piece, I don't necessarily want to do, you know, a lot of that and weigh it down in that way. Or sometimes if it's a journalistic piece, they want to cut things that they think are too in depth that people don't need to know, but I actually think is really crucial to understanding the issue. You know, so it's like you're constantly kind of making those negotiations, you know, for yourself and also with, you know, editors and, you know, publishers and so forth.
Well, talking about like negotiating those things, like the second chapter is how we're all connected. It's, you know, the relationship between writer, reader, and subject. It's like you talked about, like you may have the know-how, you may have the expertise, but you got to get it across. You have to make it compelling. You have to make it interesting. You have to make it the reader connect. And you know, you made an important point, which is maybe, I mean, is maybe not like a huge discovery for people, but so worth reinforcing and mentioning. Just like, don't leave out the voices or the stories of those impacted. You may, you know, a lot of the things that I really took from this book is like, you know, there are people who are trying to do the right thing.
Yes.
Right. As writers, but they don't think it through. They don't.
No.
There was no, you make good points too about, you know, I want to get this point across, whatever it is. I even want this person to shine, the victim. I want them to be heard, but am I re-traumatizing? Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And who's, you know, am I able to tell this person's story? Should I be telling this person's story? Can someone tell it better than me? You know, that's like the best case. And then the worst case is, you know, American Dirt.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And it's just amazing to see how people justify, you know, they you know, they will justify. And, you know, these things I don't have, they're not always clear-cut answers. I'm trying to at least pose people with questions to ensure that they've had these considerations, you know, because then, because here's the, you know, to me, when I think about that, there are writers who want to engage issues, who are coming with the best of intentions, and then maybe they're looking at the environment. You know, like one of the things, there's, you know, a whole chapter on cultural sensitivity and avoiding cultural appropriation. And I, as a writer, as an emerging writer of color, I had to sit with that issue that was exploding every month or so, right? Or every few weeks, there's like this question that comes up, and then it's in a very binary sort of way. It's like, oh, this person culture, okay, let's cancel them. Oh, this is a culture, you know, and oh, let's cancel. And what this binary competition doesn't allow for an actual conversation or dialogue. And what it doesn't, and what I had to sit with was, you know, I felt my own thoughts, you know, in terms of knowing how undiverse the publishing sector is. And so we would have this conversation about this singular person in this situation and, you know, what the response should be, but not about the broader systems. And that's how a lot of conversations in this country are. You know, we like to, you know, in the place where I used to work, we used to say, we don't want to write about just the racists and, you know, and the reaction to the racists. We want to talk about systems that are enabling this on a broad scale, right? And so that's how I felt, is like we have these, hot takes, on this, on the issue of the moment of the person who, who has transgressed potentially, but we don't talk about, why it is, and and I had to sit down and ask myself, how do I want to censor people? Is that, like, what do I think as a writer? Do I want to be censored? Do I want somebody limiting what I think, And I thought, no, I think humanity, having a shared humanity means, I think most people should be able to write about most things. That's how I really felt. So then I said, so what am I upset about, really? It's not really that this person wrote about this, because I do believe, as an artist, as a writer, most anybody write about most anything. It's about how they approached it, and how insensitive they were, and how they didn't even take the time to educate themselves on some basic things, or to really, most importantly, reflect on who they are as they write about this other community that they are not a part of. And that's really the part that I find often missing. And that's why it was so important to include Caitlin Greenidge's piece, which I think complicates the issue in the best way, because she is a Black writer, talking about supporting her fellow writer Bill Chang, writing a novel about, I think it's about the Reconstruction era, in the United States, about Black folks in the South, during that time. And I remember that book coming out after I became a writer, and I remember quiet debates about whether he should be able to write that book. And, and I myself thought, I'm such a slow reader, if I have the opportunity to read, should I read his book, about that, or should I read a Black writer's book about that era? And it's a I honestly remember thinking, and then I thought, should I be even asking myself that question? Shouldn't it be about the book? And shouldn't and these are questions that are swirling. And I started teaching about it in my class, I felt like it was really important. And what do you know? I would get the most questions about this topic. And some people were really, concerned, and they wanted to, do right by things. And so I decided to have a very substantive chapter in this book about the topic.
Well, I was really struck by the story, the Alexander Chee, who's obviously a great writer.
Oh my!
And he decided not to write a story that he felt, it was about the detective couple, and it sounded like a great story. You know what I mean? Like you could see that being a great movie or a great fictional piece. That he would take some of the real life. But it wasn't necessarily for like racial reasons or anything like that. It was just kind of like, this isn't the story to tell. It's not for me at this time to write for these various different reasons. And like, I know as writers, a lot of times it's like, oh man, like if I have this idea that's cool, like I'm gonna latch on. But the whole idea of like killing your darling is like, he killed that darling.
And I it's like, if I love Alexander Chee, his writing. I love, his advocacy that he does on and off the page. But I would love to ask him more about that and understand, the deeper reasons, because sometimes, there's like I've had, white writers say to me, oh, Kavita, you write about really trendy, sexy stuff like race and, and they've said this. It's happened multiple times. And, and I thought, oh, it's not because I given where I came from and, how I came to writing, I felt compelled. I felt like I could not, I felt it was like the way that I would continue the work in my new identity as a writer. And I felt compelled, and that's usually what makes me write things, because I'm like, feel very, very compelled. It's not that I'm following a trend or a beat, and it's deeply unfortunate that, it's kind of looked that way. But what I was getting at also is that sometimes things are very sparkly to us, but then when we go to actually delve into it, realize we don't have the depth to
Yeah.
actually fully realize that. And I wonder if he felt like, I found that interesting, but actually I don't really want to inhabit
Right.
that world, and it's like, I think that sometimes it would be better served if some writers who are approaching social issues as if they are beats or trends, stepped back and said, am I doing what, and going back to the very first chapter, what is my motivations?
Yeah.
And what are the implications of this half-baked thing going out into the world, like American Dirt?
Yeah. Yeah. The, obviously sensitivity is a huge part of being a writer, and that relationship between writer, reader, and subject. Please help me. Is it Jyoti Singh?
Oh, Jyoti Singh, yes.
Jyoti.
Oh my gosh,
Right.
yeah.
So you used the two essays that you'd written about her as illustrations. She was the victim of a horrific sexual assault and murder, right? This was maybe
Yeah.
like 2012 or so.
Something like that, yes.
Yeah. And so one of the pieces called Tramp, which is like the translation of a Bollywood movie that that is not directly related to the subject matter. And then you wrote about your connections to that movie and how you did see a connection
Yeah.
to the modern day crime. And then there's Jyoti's Rainbow,
Yeah.
and about, like, it's so meta, right? It's like about four artistic pieces that were in response to that.
Yes,
You're
exactly.
writing about those, and just the idea of being very sensitive, not wanting to compromise her dignity,
Yeah.
but really seeing lessons, and then really seeing, how have other people dealt with this, and didn't make it just about, it wasn't just 100% subjective. So I
Yeah.
thought that was a really nice balance that you had there.
Thank you. I one of the things I usually try to do is share with my students two pieces. So you've seen this a couple of times during the book. So I think Garnett Cadigan has two pieces
Yeah.
on kind of experiencing the world as a Black man.
Mhm.
Shakira Diaz, also one of my friends and one of my favorite writers, has two pieces on, young Latinas, who are, in danger. And then, so I usually try to introduce students to two pieces on the
Yeah.
same topic by the same writer, but taking two different approaches to show that it doesn't have to be different people. It can be the same person can approach the same topic in sometimes in a deeply personal way, and sometimes in a more, hands out, examining it from different angles, sort of a way. And with that, I was deeply traumatized and troubled by what happened to Jyoti Singh, and what it says about my culture, and being a woman, and and all of that. And I really, I kind of turned to these different artistic pieces to see what are other people, what are we thinking about this, what does this mean, for our culture, and how can we, especially against the whole kind of model minority myth, and this idea that Indians are doctors, and like all these things, that positive messages that are kind of put out into the world, and meanwhile we don't talk about this, we don't talk about caste issues. That's why it was also important to include a piece by Yashika Dutt talking about caste issues. I myself, my family is actually split by caste. So, it's something that's, really, really important. And yet at the same time, the piece that you mentioned, Tramp, I remember when I found out that the translation of the title of that movie is Tramp, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is kind of, and you remember from the story, it's like, women's lives were so arbitrated by
Yes.
And it actually, I don't know if I talked about it too much in that piece, but it goes back to like a Hindu mythology. So they've basically brought that into the modern age with that Bollywood movie. And that piece was actually edited by Roxane Gay when she was at the Rumpus. And I remember meeting her,
Did you faint?
Huh?
Did you
I
faint?
held myself up, barely. And you won't believe it. It was at the Asian American Writers Workshop, and I met Roxane Gay right as Bad Feminists, was like coming out, and I had just, started, and I said, hi, you actually edited my first piece. And she's like, oh, you're Kavita, you're a good writer. And like that sustained me for like
Yeah,
so
yeah,
long.
yeah,
I
yeah.
still remember those words. Like I was like, Roxanne Gay knows who I
Mm, I know, right?
am.
Oh my
She's
gosh.
a good writer. And even if she was lying to me, that's okay too. Because I think about how many thousands upon thousands of people she had seen at that
Right.
point.
Oh man. Well,
So
you mentioned, I'm sorry, tell me the first name again of Cadigan, the writer.
Garnett Cadigan,
Yeah.
yes, one of
The
my favorite.
your pieces on Jyoti Singh, and I mean all throughout the book. I mean, it's just not to get on my podium or my what's the word, the soapbox, but like with with the decreased reading and the general populace, and it's not as bad as it seems. There are a lot of readers now, and of course with the book banning and such, it's like
Mm.
how do you not become more sympathetic, more empathetic by reading? You do. You automatically have to. How do you not grow to appreciate more Yoti Singh's story and feel for her? And how do you not read? I read the piece about walking,
Oh
right?
my gosh.
Called
Yeah,
Black and Blue from
yeah,
Cadigan, and it's like
yeah.
Whitman wrote so romantically, so eloquently, just about walking and exploring. And I know that as
Mm.
a white man, like as a male, I guess I think of safety and not not wanting to intimidate others, maybe in that kind of way, and crossing. But as a white man, I don't have to think about those things. I mean, it's so moving. He talks about like like the uniform he had to wear, basically, not this
Mm.
color, not that color. He doesn't want
Yeah.
to backtrack if he's walking in front of somebody and he goes backwards. That's a sign of danger. And it's just like, man, walking should be peaceful and calming. And
And that's the thing, the experience when, when I have students who have an experience that speaks to the social issue that gets
yeah.
beyond, one of the things I tell them is that people can disagree with your point of view or your opinion, but they
Mhm.
can't disagree with your experience.
Right.
I mean, they probably can, but like they can't. I mean, nowadays they can disagree with
Yeah,
everything. But
sadly, yes.
no, but I feel like this is one of the things that I think is really powerful, that beyond the pro this and anti this is
Mm.
one of the most, I remember one of the most affecting,
Mhm.
pieces opinion pieces that I read during the Confederate monument,
Mhm.
conversation about, are you erasing history? Are you
Mm.
reckoning with history? That whole kind of back and forth was a piece, and I'm not remembering her name. I think it's Rebecca Carroll. I might be wrong. Called "My Body is a Confederate Monument," and it's about
Mm.
her mixed race history and the facts behind that mixed race history,
Mhm.
and it's like it kind of took the issue in a third direction.
Mm.
It's like, you know
Not a binary, yeah.
yeah, it's an embodied
It's nuanced.
experience of this issue that goes beyond, pros and cons,
Mm.
and I think that that's extremely powerful, and another way to engage with, social issues in a way that, and I always say that, now to be realistic, it's hard to change people's minds nowadays because of
Mm.
the way media is being consumed, that, people read what they already agree with, and so they're not getting exposed to other points of view. So I think that it's, but you do have people who are undecided, who are trying to figure things out. And
Mm.
so I think it's sometimes, rather than thinking about trying to change someone's mind who is so
Yeah.
far, off in another direction, I think about that person who is thinking about the issues, but has been steeped, whose history, maybe whether it's their religious background or their, family background, has pushed them in one direction,
Mm.
and you have the opportunity to suggest to them an alternate perspective, not, in terms of shouting at them, but saying, let me tell you what it's like for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let me bring you into my experience.